because not only will he be shown to be a liar, but an ineffective liar.
Welcome, Curious Minds, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into a story that's really been dominating headlines, sparking some, well, furious debates, and leaving a lot of us wondering, what really happened?
Yeah.
We're talking about the recent very high-stakes bombing campaign targeting Iranian nuclear facilities. You've definitely seen the bold declarations, the official statements. But what's the actual reality behind those claims of success?
It's a huge question.
For me, it's that immediate gap, you
Yeah.
know, that chasm between the confident declarations and this nagging feeling that something just doesn't quite add up.
Indeed. And this isn't just about, the spectacle of explosions and rubble we might see on the news. It's much deeper.
Right.
It's a complex, multi-layered web. Information, official claims, leaked intelligence assessments, and this critical need to actually assess what truly transpired on the ground.
Yeah.
We have this fascinating, almost jarring tension to unpack. On one side, you hear the administration proclaiming what they describe as complete and total obliteration of Iran's nuclear sites. Strong words.
Very strong, almost definitive.
But then on the other side, you get expert analysis, people like former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter calling it a farce, and these quietly leaked intelligence reports painting a very different picture.
A picture suggesting what?
Suggesting these vital facilities may not have been destroyed at all, or maybe more critically, that the strikes completely missed the real target, which, as we'll get into, is that central accusation from Ritter, they didn't get the uranium.
And that's precisely our mission today, isn't it? We want to try and cut through all that noise, unpack these conflicting narratives,
Yeah, well, look at the technical side, too.
explore the technical realities of nuclear programs, because they're not simple, and delves into the profound geopolitical, maybe even moral implications when official statements clash so starkly with intelligence assessments.
It's about credibility, really.
We'll look at the data, the history, what this all means for global credibility, future actions, helping you, listening, navigate these complex currents of information. So what stands out to you listening to these initial, very strong claims?
Well, like you said, the strength of the language itself. Complete and total obliteration. It's so absolute.
It is. And for us, it's the audacity, right? Especially when, as we'll soon discover, those claims were almost immediately challenged by the very people, the intelligence folks, tasked with knowing the ground truth.
Exactly. That disconnect is the story here.
Okay, so let's begin by just laying out the administration's narrative.
Yeah.
Loud and clear, they're projecting this image of undeniable success, a really decisive blow. So maybe walk us through the claims and the events.
Sure. So the strikes we're really focusing on, they happened over two distinct periods. First, there was June 13th,
Okay.
and then another significant wave reportedly on an unnamed Sunday, which we assume was June 15th or 16th, that weekend.
Got it.
These operations were specifically designed, or so we're told, to target Iran's declared nuclear and military facilities, key sites.
And the language used.
The U.S. government described these as unprecedented strikes. That's a term, carefully chosen. It's meant to convey the magnitude, the power, and importantly, the presumed impact.
Unprecedented impact.
Right. Specifically hitting key Iranian nuclear sites like Fordo, Isfahan, and Natanz. These are the big names everyone knows.
And then the president himself weighed in.
He did. And the language he used was, well, remarkably strong. It left very little room for misinterpretation, certainly of his intent.
What did he say exactly?
He declared quite directly complete and total obliteration of Iran's nuclear sites.
Wow. Complete and total obliteration.
Yeah. Not a nuanced statement, is it? It was a definitive pronouncement. Clearly intended to convey absolute, unequivocal success, a decisive blow that supposedly neutralized Iran's nuclear capabilities.
It's the kind of rhetoric designed to resonate, right?
Yeah.
Domestically, internationally.
Absolutely. Projecting unwavering resolve,
Yeah.
sending a message.
That's a powerful statement, no doubt. And it certainly landed with the public. But the very next question that pops up, obviously, is what was happening behind the scenes. Because these counter-narratives started emerging pretty quickly.
Almost immediately. And the White House response was notable, swift and aggressive in rejecting them.
How so?
They publicly called the leaked intelligence assessment, the one that contradicted their obliteration claim, they called it flat out wrong. Just dismissed it.
Flat out wrong. Okay.
And the president himself, he directly criticized specific news outlets, named CNN, named the New York Times, accused them of trying to, and this is a quote, demean one of the most successful military strikes in history.
So framing skepticism as unpatriotic almost.
Essentially, yeah. It was a full-throated defense of the official line, clearly designed to shut down any doubt, any alternative interpretation, frame any questioning as an attack on military achievement itself.
But what's truly fascinating here, and this really gets to the core of the controversy that someone like Scott Ritter has been hammering on about, it's the stark counter-narrative coming from within the intelligence community.
Exactly. Those early U.S. intelligence assessments, the very ones the White House so vehemently rejected, they indicated something very different. That the strikes on Iran did not destroy the nuclear sites. That's the crux of it. A public declaration of total obliteration clashing directly with internal classified assessments suggesting only partial damage, or critically insufficient damage to actually halt the program.
So not just a difference in emphasis, but a fundamental disagreement.
A fundamental disagreement about the effectiveness of the military action, yeah.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me, and frankly, quite unsettling if you're trying to understand the true impact. One of the most striking details in those leaked reports was this surprising revelation.
About the defense secretary?
Yes, that the U.S. Defense Secretary was reportedly unaware of any intelligence suggesting Iran had moved its uranium to shield it from the U.S. strikes over that weekend.
Which is kind of mind-blowing.
Right. Think about that. If the ultimate strategic goal, the whole point, is to stop Iran getting a bomb, and the material for that bomb, the highly enriched uranium, could potentially be moved and hidden.
And you don't know where it is.
Exactly. What was the true objective of striking the facilities if you have no intel on the material's location? It just raises this immediate, massive question about the efficacy, the point of the operation.
It absolutely does. And this is where Scott Ritter's accusation of a farce really starts to gain traction, doesn't it?
It seems so.
If the most critical component for a weapon, the HEU itself, could be easily moved, or maybe was already hidden somewhere else entirely, then hitting the facilities alone, no matter how powerful the bombs are,
It might be missing the point.
it might be missing the actual target. It suggests a fundamental disconnect between the stated objective, stop the bomb, and the known realities of safeguarding nuclear material.
So without knowing where the uranium is,
Any claim of total obliteration of Iran's nuclear program just rings hollow. It's like trying to drain a bathtub by smashing the faucet when someone's already scooped the water out into buckets and hidden them.
that's a good analogy. Okay, let's dig into Fordo specifically, because it feels like a perfect case study in this whole conflict of narratives and the challenge of assessing damage against a really resilient target.
Fordo is unique, absolutely. It's not just a building on the surface.
Right, it's buried.
Deeply buried, carved into a mountain about 300 feet underground near the city of Qom. Experts consistently describe it as Iran's most fortified target and the most difficult to completely dismantle conventionally.
300 feet, that's deep.
It is. It's very designed, nestled deep within rock, was specifically conceived to protect it from exactly this kind of thing, aerial bombardment. It makes it a formidable challenge for any conventional military strike.
And the military action against it, this Operation Midnight Hammer, as it was reportedly called, it was pretty immense, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. The name itself evokes that clandestine, high-impact nature of the mission, and they threw the kitchen sink at it, basically.
Meaning?
US B-2 Spirit bombers were deployed, stealth bombers, and they dropped no less than 12 GBU-57 bunker buster bombs.
12, the big ones.
The really big ones. The GBU-57, also known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, these aren't just large bombs, they're specifically designed for this.
Oh, so.
They have this hardened, ultra-dense steel casing and an incredibly powerful explosive payload weighing about 30,000 pounds each.
30,000 pounds.
Yeah. Its whole purpose is to penetrate hundreds of feet of reinforced concrete and rock before detonating. So theoretically, it's capable of reaching deeply buried targets like Fordo. It was touted, quite rightly, as the most powerful conventional aerial strike option in the U.S. arsenal for exactly this kind of hard target penetration.
Okay, so 12 30,000-pound bunker busters designed for deep penetration. Yet despite that immense power, what did we see?
Well, despite that, the early satellite imagery, which started to surface and get analyzed by independent experts, it suggested only partial damage.
Only partial, not obliteration.
Not obliteration, not total destruction, partial damage. Maybe to parts of the facility's surface infrastructure, access points perhaps. But it's a direct visual contradiction of the president's sweeping claims. It really suggests that even our most powerful conventional weapons face severe limitations against these super hardened targets.
And wasn't there hesitation from officials, too?
Yes, that's another key piece. We saw direct hesitation, even public contradiction, from within the U.S. official ranks. Vice President J.D. Vance, a very high-ranking member of the administration.
What did he say?
He publicly refused to confirm that the facility was destroyed.
Refused to confirm. That directly contradicts complete and total obliteration.
Directly and conspicuously. It raises a huge question, right? Why the discrepancy in official statements from different levels of the same administration, especially when one figure holds such a high office?
What does it imply?
It implies, well, maybe a lack of internal consensus on the true outcome. Or perhaps an unwillingness from some to echo a claim that isn't fully backed up by the intelligence or the battle damage assessments they were seeing.
And without independent verification.
Exactly. And crucially, without independent access for bodies like the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, to get onto these sites, it could be a considerable while until the full extent of the damage is truly known. It leaves this significant information gap for everyone.
That information gap is critical, isn't it? And it extends beyond just Fordo. It seems like it immediately led to significant skepticism right up in Congress.
It did. Reports surfaced that U.S. senators were set to meet with top national security officials. And not just to ask, did it work?
What else?
They wanted to question the success, sure, the battle damage assessment methodology, but also the very decision to bomb in the first place. The underlying intelligence that supposedly justified such a drastic action.
It's challenging the premise, not just the outcome.
Precisely. This isn't just political grandstanding. It's about legislative oversight, accountability, especially on military actions of this magnitude, actions that carry immense geopolitical risks and potentially involve the deliberate use of, shall we say, questionable intelligence.
And that skepticism is leading to actual action.
It looks like it. The Senate is expected to vote on a resolution that would fundamentally change things. It would require congressional approval for any future strikes on Iran.
That's a big deal.
It's huge. It signals a clear, significant lack of full confidence in the executive branch's unilateral actions and its assessment of the outcomes. It's a powerful legislative attempt to rein in potential future military engagements.
So Congress is saying, hold on, we need more proof.
Essentially, yes. It suggests Congress, too, is seeking more verifiable facts, more adherence to constitutional checks and balances, rather than just accepting broad, unsubstantiated claims of success. It really reflects a deep-seated concern about how intelligence is being used and communicated.
This brings us nicely to a fundamental point in understanding this whole situation: Iran's nuclear program itself, and the immense technical challenge of truly eliminating it. We've heard the claims, total obliteration. But what does that actually mean when you're talking about a highly sophisticated program, one that's been decades in the making and is designed for resilience?
Yeah, elimination is a very strong word in this context. To truly grasp this, we need to understand the role of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and this framework of international oversight.
Okay.
It's crucial to remember IAEA inspectors, they're an independent intergovernmental organization reporting to the UN. They were actually still in Iran during the bombing campaign, and they remain there now.
Even with all the tension.
Even with Iran's very vocal objections to the IAEA's recent conduct and its ongoing review of its participation in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. So it's not a complete black box. There is ongoing communication, a level of transparency, however strained it might be, that often gets overlooked in the heat of these military actions.
What's their main job again?
Their primary mandate is to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Their presence, even when it's contested, provides a vital, though often imperfect, window into nuclear activities.
And Iran has actually been talking to them, reporting things.
Yes, they have, providing at least some level of reporting. For instance, they reported that the Israeli strikes, which happened before the U.S. ones, and also targeted nuclear military facilities, tragically killing some scientists.
Right. Those happened first.
They reported those did not result in off-site radiation releases, which is significant. However, what's particularly telling and maybe more relevant to the U.S. strike's impact is that Iran did report
chemical and radiological consequences within the facilities at Natanz.
Okay, within the facilities, what's the nuance there?
The nuance is crucial. It suggests damage occurred, yes. But it wasn't the kind of catastrophic, widespread failure that implies total obliteration of the whole program or a major radioactive release spreading beyond the site itself. The distinction between off-site and within points to localized damage, containment failure perhaps, but not complete dismantlement.
So damage, yes. Obliteration, probably not.
Seems that way based on their own reporting to the IAEA, at least regarding Natanz.
And this all ties into the bigger picture with the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, right?
Right. It does. It's a very delicate context. The IAEA Board of Governors actually declared on June 12th, just a day before these initial U.S. strikes, that Iran was not complying with its NPT obligations.
That sounds serious.
It was. It marked the first time in 2 decades that such a formal declaration had been made about Iran. It signaled a real escalation in international tensions over its nuclear ambitions.
Are there precedents for this? Countries leaving the NPT?
There are. North Korea, famously, withdrew from the NPT back in 2003, and that had profound consequences for regional security, non-proliferation efforts globally. Iran is currently reviewing its participation in the NPT, which just underscores how serious the situation is and the potential ripple effects on the whole global non-proliferation regime.
Which brings us back to the question.
Right. What is truly being achieved if these strikes and the rhetoric around them actually push Iran closer to abandoning international oversight entirely, making their program even more opaque, even harder to monitor? It could be counterproductive.
Okay, let's get into the technical weeds a bit. Uranium enrichment. Because this is where it gets really interesting, I think. It helps us understand the true nature of the threat, and maybe more importantly, just how hard it is to fully eliminate a program like Iran's. We need to talk about separative work units, SWU.
SW, yeah. It sounds technical, but it's the fundamental measure. Think of it as the energy cost, or the amount of sheer work that goes into separating the fissile uranium-235 isotope from the much more common non-fissile uranium-238.
Because natural uranium is mostly the wrong stuff.
Exactly. Natural uranium is like 99.3% U-238, which won't sustain a chain reaction, and only about 0.7% U-235, which is what you need for bombs or reactors.
Yes.
Enrichment is just separating those two.
How do they do it?
Mostly using high-speed centrifuges, thousands of them, spinning incredibly fast. And the efficiency of these centrifuges dramatically impacts enrichment time, how quickly you can get to weapons-grade material.
Can you give us an idea of the numbers?
Sure. Iran's initial first-generation centrifuges, the IR-1s, they were relatively inefficient by modern standards, capable of only about 2 SW kilograms per year.
Which means?
Well, if you imagine a cascade that's a connected series of 200 of these old centrifuges working together, it would still take roughly 10 years to produce the 25 kilograms or so of 90% highly enriched uranium, HEU, that's typically considered enough for one basic nuclear bomb.
10 years for one bomb with 200 centrifuges.
Right. As one expert put it, one bomb every decade is not much of a military program. And a single early model centrifuge on its own, forget it. It would take well over 2,000 years. It illustrates the huge challenge early on.
But that perspective changes quickly if they scale up, right?
Right.
Or get better tech.
Dramatically. If you had a cascade of 1,000 of those early centrifuges, that time to a bomb drops significantly down to about 2 years. Still a high threshold if you want a real deliverable arsenal, but getting closer.
And with more centrifuges, or better ones.
If you jump to, say, 10,000 first-generation centrifuges, or fewer numbers of more advanced models like the ones Iran has been developing, that time shrinks dramatically, potentially down to about 2.5 months.
Okay, now that sounds threatening.
Now that's getting more threatening, exactly, because it means a nation could potentially cross the nuclear threshold very quickly, maybe before international bodies could effectively react or intervene. That's the breakout capability everyone worries about.
And the goal is always 90% enrichment. Yeah. HEU.
That's typically the goal for a weapon, yes.
Yeah.
90% highly enriched uranium. Now, technically, 20% enrichment is considered the minimum level for HEU, but nobody's ever actually tried to make a bomb out of 20% stuff in practice.
Why not?
Because the critical mass, the minimum amount of fissile material you need to sustain that nuclear chain reaction would be enormous, around 250 kilograms.
That's huge.
It makes it impracticably large for any kind of deliverable weapon. So the real worry, the critical threshold everyone watches, is getting to that 90% HEU. A bomb made from 90% HEU would still be bigger and maybe harder to deliver than a plutonium one, but it is absolutely a functional nuclear weapon.
And here's the part that always messes with my head. The enrichment process isn't linear, right? It's exponential.
That's the really non-intuitive part, but it's critical to grasp. It actually requires far more work, meaning more SWU, more centrifuge time, more energy to enrich uranium from its natural state of 0.7% U-235 up to that 20% level.
Okay.
Than it does to go from that 20% level all the way up to 90% HEU.
Really? So the first part is harder.
Much harder. It's because of the physics of the separation process itself. It gets exponentially easier as the concentration of U-235 increases. So the critical takeaway is, reaching bomb-grade uranium isn't a steady race. Once a nation gets across that 20% threshold, they've actually done the hardest part. The remaining leap to weaponizable material is surprisingly fast and needs far less effort.
Like climbing the steepest part of a mountain at the beginning.
And then the last bit to the summit is a relatively easy stroll.
Exactly. That's why Iran enriching to 60%, which they've done, is such a concern. They're already way up that steep slope.
And this brings us right back to that alarming point from the leaked intelligence, the point that really supports Scott Ritter's claim about this being a farce.
The defense secretary not knowing where the uranium was.
Yes. This speaks directly to the challenge of storage and concealment, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Uranium is incredibly dense. It's hard to visualize. Let me try. 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that's more than enough for several nuclear weapons.
How big would that be?
It would fit in a surprisingly small space. We're talking roughly the volume equivalent of two masses, maybe 30 to 40 centimeters on each side, less than a cubic foot each.
That's small. For 400 kilos.
Yeah. Remember, uranium is more than twice as dense as steel. Think about a heavy dumbbell. This much uranium would be considerably smaller in volume. That density makes it remarkably difficult to track. So even one of those relatively small lumps could hold hundreds of kilograms. And crucially, it wouldn't necessarily be stored in some huge, obvious vault, easily seen by satellites.
Not at all. It's easily super broken up, as the reports put it. Hidden, dispersed across various locations, maybe underground, maybe in unassuming buildings.
So the density means a bombing campaign aimed at total obliteration of the facilities.
Might not necessarily be targeting or even be capable of affecting the actual material itself, especially if that material has already been dispersed, moved, concealed in lots of smaller, harder to find caches.
Which raises that fundamental question again, the one at the heart of the farce claim.
If the ultimate goal is stopping the bomb, and the bomb-making material, the HEU, can be so easily moved and concealed,
then what does success really mean?
Exactly. What does success mean for these strikes? Is it just symbolic? Hitting buildings? Or is it genuinely crippling the program? The intelligence suggesting they didn't know where the uranium was highlights this gaping hole in any narrative of total obliteration, because you're missing the most critical component.
You can bomb a building,
but you can't bomb material that's already been moved somewhere you don't know.
This entire situation, the bold claims, the conflicting intel, the technical challenges, these unsettling questions about the uranium's location, it leads us straight into the danger zone, doesn't it? The peril of politicized intelligence and unsubstantiated claims. It feels like a dangerous pattern we've seen before.
It really does, and it's a particularly dangerous game when policymakers allow their political agenda, their desired outcome, to dictate or even warp the intelligence they receive and act upon.
How does that typically happen?
Well, one crucial thing to understand is that policymakers, like all humans, but maybe more so given the stakes, are prone to interpreting intelligence through the lens of their own existing beliefs, especially when they're personally invested in an issue or a policy outcome.
Confirmation bias, basically.
Exactly. And this, understandably, breeds significant discontent among career intelligence officers. They see their objective analysis being ignored, or subtly altered, or sometimes overtly twisted to fit a predetermined narrative.
So they get frustrated.
Deeply. And this dynamic can lead policymakers not just to ignore intel that doesn't support their preferred policies, but even worse, to actively pressure the intelligence community to deliver supporting estimates, to create this false image of consensus support where none truly exists.
That sounds like a truly dangerous path for any government, especially a democracy. Why would leaders do that? What are the incentives?
Well, leaders often have potent incentives to oversell their decisions, don't they? particularly if they're facing domestic opposition, maybe grappling with low approval ratings, or they just need to rally public and international support for a controversial action, like a military strike.
Right, they need to sell it.
And in those scenarios, intelligence, which carries this inherent weight of objective fact, or at least is perceived that way, becomes a particularly useful public relations vehicle.
But there's a cost.
A significant and corrosive cost. The persuasive power and, critically, the public trust in intelligence as an objective source of truth declines dramatically the more it's perceived as being used for political advocacy rather than factual assessment. It erodes the very foundation of informed public discourse and decision-making. You cry wolf too many times.
And we don't have to look far back in history to find really clear, stark echoes of this kind of politicization, do we?
Not at all. Take Operation Desert Storm, back in 1991, the first Gulf War. After the conflict, U.S. intelligence assessments revealed something quite startling.
Which was?
That they had successfully located only about half of Saddam Hussein's major nuclear sites in Iraq beforehand.
Only half, despite all the focus.
Only half. Now, interestingly, this wasn't necessarily classified as an intelligence failure in the traditional sense. Why? Because, crucially, intelligence experts had warned policymakers beforehand. They said they lacked sufficient knowledge, they had low confidence regarding the full extent of Iraq's clandestine nuclear program.
So they admitted what they didn't know.
Exactly. A true failure would have been if they'd claimed high confidence in knowing every site and then were proven wrong. This nuance is critical for you, the listener, to understand. It's about the honest assessment of what is known, and just as importantly, what isn't known. The problem isn't always incorrect intelligence. It's often the misrepresentation or the exaggeration of the intelligence we do have.
But then, just over a decade later, we saw a much clearer case of politicization in practice, didn't we? Leading up to the Iraq War in 2003.
Oh, absolutely. In 2002, the run-up to the invasion, the administration increasingly leaned on the intelligence community to inflate the Iraqi threat. How? By making the absolute most of limited, often ambiguous data, and in some documented cases, pushing the boundaries of what the intelligence actually suggested.
There was pressure.
Direct pressure. Reports surfaced of direct pressure applied to intelligence officials to join the policy consensus. They even went so far as to create a separate parallel intelligence unit within the Pentagon, the Office of Special Plans, which was notorious for selectively cherry-picking intelligence that bolstered the case for war, often bypassing the traditional vetting processes of agencies like the CIA.
And Congress noticed.
Even skeptical members of Congress noted alarming differences between the highly classified, nuanced judgments being presented to them in secure briefings and the much more definitive, often alarming, declassified white papers that were being released to the public to build support for the war. It clearly underscores this disturbing pattern. Executive branches using intelligence not as a guide for policy, but as a justification for predetermined policy, regardless of factual accuracy.
There was that chilling quote, too, wasn't there? From inside the CIA.
There was a very chilling, often cited quote from a senior CIA subordinate during that lead-up period. They reportedly told a colleague, almost with a sense of resignation, "It's time you learn it's not about intelligence anymore, it's about regime change." That anecdote just perfectly illustrates the ultimate dangerous consequence of politicization. Intelligence stops being a tool for objective understanding, for risk assessment, for informed decision-making. Instead, it becomes just another instrument, a lever for achieving a political agenda, regardless of the underlying facts, and with potentially catastrophic consequences for national and international security, as we saw.
To make matters even more complicated, for all of us trying to assess these situations, we humans, we're all susceptible to something called hindsight bias.
Oh, yes, hindsight bias. It's a powerful cognitive trap. It's our inherent difficulty in accurately recalling our past uncertainties or probabilities once we know the actual outcome.
We think we knew it all along.
Exactly. Our minds tend to rewrite history, making us believe we knew it all along, that a certain outcome was inevitable, or at least highly probable, even if at the time the situation was incredibly uncertain, foggy, full of conflicting signals.
Can we fight it?
It's incredibly intractable. Psychological experiments have shown this again and again. Even when subjects are specifically briefed on the bias, told what it is, and instructed to try and compensate for it, they generally can't.
Really? Why not?
Despite maximum information, best intentions, the bias persists because it seems deeply rooted in how our brains construct narratives, how we make sense of the world. We crave coherent stories, and knowing the ending makes it hard to remember the confusing middle parts.
So what does this mean for judging intelligence or policy?
Well, it makes it incredibly difficult for intelligence analysts themselves to reevaluate their own judgments fairly after an event. And it makes it tough for congressional overseers or the public to fairly judge past intelligence failures or successes. Because the outcome, whether it was good or bad, inevitably colors our perception of what was knowable or probable back then.
So how does this hindsight bias affect public and political reactions when these claims of success or failure are made, like with the Iran strikes, especially if the intelligence might have been politicized from the start?
It adds another profound layer of complexity to getting at the truth, doesn't it? It means that even after the dust settles, even if contradictory evidence emerges later, there's this powerful psychological tendency for people to accept the initially declared outcome, especially if it was declared forcefully as having been obvious or preordained.
Making it harder to hold people accountable.
Exactly. It makes it harder to hold leaders accountable for potentially exaggerated or false claims made in the heat of the moment. And perhaps more damagingly, it prevents genuine lessons from being learned for the future. Because we gloss over the uncertainties and pressures that led to the initial decision or assessment. We think, oh, it was obvious, when it really wasn't.
All of this, the conflicting claims, the questions about effectiveness, the history of politicized intelligence, the challenges of knowing the truth, it brings us squarely to the geopolitical stakes. And crucially, the credibility of the United States on the world stage. These aren't just internal arguments or domestic politics. They have wide-ranging, potentially dangerous global repercussions.
Indeed they do. Let's think about Iran's reaction first, and its stance on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. As we mentioned, Iran is currently reviewing their participation in the NPT.
Why now?
Explicitly in light of these U.S. strikes and what it perceives as the IAEA's biased conduct leading up to them, what's really fascinating and worrying here is the potential ripple effect on the entire global non-proliferation regime. That treaty has been a cornerstone of international security since the 1960s.
What's the core idea of the NPT again?
It's designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, promote peaceful nuclear energy, and pursue disarmament. But if a nation, especially one under intense international scrutiny like Iran, starts to perceive that cooperating with the NPT, allowing inspectors, actually makes it more vulnerable to attack rather than more secure.
Then why cooperate?
Exactly. It could choose to step away entirely, and that's a very serious threat to global stability. It could potentially encourage other nations, seeing this, to pursue nuclear weapons outside of international safeguards, in secret.
But Iran is still talking to the IAEA for now.
Yes, that's the important caveat. Despite these threats, Iran is still communicating with the IAEA. It suggests a delicate balance is being maintained, for now at least, between outright defiance and a strategic review of their options. It's tense.
Okay, now let's talk about the absolute core of Scott Ritter's argument, which he frames very bluntly as a dangerous political lie. This is where the rubber really meets the road for international relations, isn't it?
This is the credibility factor, and it's huge. If Iran were able to produce concrete, verifiable evidence, maybe through international media tours of the sites, maybe inviting UN inspectors back to specific locations, maybe revealing hidden uranium caches they claim the US missed.
What happened?
If they could show their nuclear facilities are in fact largely intact or quickly repairable after these supposedly obliterating strikes, it could, as Ritter argues, catastrophically undermine the credibility of the US president and his administration on the world stage.
Catastrophically undermine.
Those are strong words, but the potential impact is immense. This isn't just about domestic political embarrassment. It's about a nation's global trust, its influence, its fundamental ability to lead or be believed. The perceived untruthfulness of a major power, especially on something this serious, has cascading consequences.
Have we seen any immediate fallout? Reactions from other countries?
We have. There were immediate international reactions that really highlight this profound risk. The Pakistani prime minister, for instance. He called the Iranian president to express concerns over the U.S. strike and publicly condemned it as a violation of international law.
Okay, expected maybe between those two countries.
Perhaps. But what makes it particularly noteworthy is that the same Pakistani prime minister had, literally the day before, publicly credited the U.S. president for a legacy of pragmatic diplomacy in other regional conflicts, specifically mentioning the ceasefire with India that the U.S. helped broker.
Wow, so a complete 180.
A rapid and dramatic shift in diplomatic tone, from praise for pragmatic diplomacy to condemnation for violating international law in less than 24 hours. It illustrates the immediate damaging impact on relations when questions of credibility arise from these bold, potentially unsubstantiated military claims. It shows just how quickly trust can evaporate.
So let's spell it out. What's the so what? Why does U.S. credibility matter so much on the world stage, particularly in this context?
Well, if a nation's word, especially when it comes to military success, intelligence assessments, reasons for conflict, is perceived as untruthful or exaggerated or a deliberate misrepresentation, it fundamentally erodes trust, not just with adversaries, but critically, with allies too.
And that makes everything harder.
Everything. It complicates future diplomatic efforts massively.
Yeah.
It makes it significantly harder to negotiate treaties, to form and maintain alliances, to enforce international sanctions, or even to rally international coalitions for shared security challenges like counterterrorism or climate change.
So it affects leadership.
If we connect it to the bigger picture, yes. It directly impacts a nation's ability to lead international initiatives, to shape global norms, to maintain any semblance of global order based on shared understanding or trust. It basically signals to the world, this nation's statements cannot be reliably trusted, even on matters of war and peace.
And these events, they don't happen in a vacuum, right? They play into wider geopolitical trends.
Absolutely. They play directly into these wider implications for geopolitics. We're already in a period of, as many analysts say, tectonic shifts in power, economic centers, and trade. We're seeing a general increase of conflicts and defense spending globally. These are identified as top global risks already.
And unsubstantiated claims fuel that.
Unsubstantiated claims, or a perceived lack of truthfulness from a major power like the U.S., could absolutely destabilize an already fragile global security environment. It contributes to even greater mistrust, more unpredictability, a heightened sense of risk among nations, both allies and rivals. It just makes all future negotiations and cooperative ventures that much harder, that much more fraught.
And there's that deeply unsettling, maybe unintended consequence for non-nuclear states too, the ones the NPT is supposed to reassure.
That's a really important point. If these other countries, the non-nuclear weapon states, perceive that allowing international inspectors onto their soil as required by the NPT actually makes them more vulnerable to preemptive strikes, or that the international community can't reliably protect them even if they are in compliance,
What might they conclude?
they could logically conclude they have an additional motive to be discreet about any weaponizing activities. Why be transparent if transparency paints a target on your back and the attacker might exaggerate the threat anyway?
So could these strikes actually accelerate proliferation?
It raises that incredibly important and frankly perverse question. Could these strikes, especially if they're perceived as ineffective or based on false pretenses, inadvertently end up accelerating nuclear proliferation rather than halting it? By encouraging secrecy and opacity, driving programs further underground rather than promoting transparency and compliance under international safeguards, it's a very real concern.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it seems the whole incident, from the initial bold claims through the conflicting intelligence, the questions about uranium, the diplomatic fallout, it just highlights this critical need for governments to be more rigorous, right?
Absolutely. Rigorous about applying things like contingency plans and lessons learned processes. We usually think about those in terms of, preparing for supply chain disruptions or improving project management or refining military tactics after an operation.
But this is different.
Right. But here, the profound need is to apply that same kind of rigorous self-assessment, that same demand for evidence and honesty, not just to internal projects, but to the much higher stakes realm of international relations, and critically to how intelligence is communicated both internally and externally, especially when these incredibly high stakes claims about military outcomes are being made.
Because the cost of getting it wrong or being seen to lie.
The cost of what Ritter calls a dangerous political lie extends far, far beyond the immediate headlines or domestic political cycles. It damages trust for years, maybe decades.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just quickly recap. We've really unpacked this stark contrast, haven't we, between the administration's claims of complete and total obliteration in striking Iran's nuclear facilities.
And on the other hand, the quietly leaked intelligence suggesting only partial damage. And, maybe most critically, Scott Ritter's central accusation that the administration had, quote, no clue where the actual bomb material, the highly enriched uranium, was even located.
Rendering any claims of total obliteration of the program itself highly suspect, if not, as he says, a farce.
Exactly.
And this deep dive, it really isn't just about Iran, is it?
Yeah.
It feels like a powerful illustration of this inherent, often deeply uncomfortable tension between political narratives, what leaders want to be true, and intelligence realities, what the facts on the ground suggest.
It really shows us how crucial it is for all of us to critically examine official statements, to look beyond the headlines, beyond the confident pronouncements.
Understand the technical complexities, too.
Yes, to understand the technical complexities behind the sensational claims, because often the devil is in those details, like enrichment or concealment, and to recognize the profound impact that perceived truthfulness, or the alarming lack thereof, has on a nation's credibility, its standing, its effectiveness on the global stage.
Absolutely. So as you, listening, consider the information we've explored today, the claims, the counterclaims, the technical realities, the historical echoes, the potential consequences. Maybe think about this.
Yeah.
In this age we live in, an age of instant information, competing narratives, where official statements can be almost immediately contradicted by leaked intelligence or independent analysis, how can you, as an informed citizen, actually discern the difference? The difference between strategic communication, which is designed to shape public perception, and verifiable fact, especially when it comes to these critical matters of national security and international conflict.
It's tough.
It is. And what responsibility does that place on each of us as consumers of information to actually dig deeper, to question, to demand evidence, rather than just accepting the first loudest narrative we hear?